we're going to get started. I want to thank you all for two things. The first thing is being patient with us as we've gotten our recording equipment up and running. But the second is, you all may not realize this, but you all are participating in the first live event that we've had for 18 months, which contributes to, I think, part of why the recording has been such an issue, unfortunately. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here and for giving your attention to our guest today, Dr. Matthew Harris, who is a professor of history at Colorado State University, Colorado Springs. He received his PhD from Syracuse University and is the author, editor, compiler of multiple books on the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You see two of them up here. I was going to give you their titles, but you can actually see the covers, which is better than that. I will just mention that Matt is, I think, one of the great researchers and one of the really prime historians of the 20th century history of Mormonism that we have. His work is interesting and important, and I hope you will all give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for that generous introduction. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. What Matt didn't tell you is he contributed a fine essay for this book on the right called Thunder from the Right. Matt wrote a nice essay that really added to the credibility of the work. All right, so I've been thinking about Benson, Ezra Taft Benson. You can see that I have two books on this church leader, this seminal government leader as well. And so I was telling Matt that I had no idea that there would be such a response in this church leader. And it's interesting how people read your work. They link it together with current politics. I get emails from people all the time. And my book doesn't mention, the one on the left is the most recent one, doesn't mention Donald Trump once, but I typically get people who link the two together. It's really fascinating to me. So what I want to do tonight is I want to introduce you to Benson and give you a part of him that you may not know. I think most of you, if some of you, or all of you, or many of you come from an LDS background, you know a little bit about him. But I want to take you behind the scenes tonight and give you a sense of who he is and talk about why he has such an incredible influence over the church today. That's really the question I want to tackle today. So why is that, and what does it look like in the 21st century? All right, so why a book on Benson? Well, one of the reasons is that he's one of the most influential conservative voices in the post-World War II era. I think a lot of Latter-day Saints have a very insular view of him, that he's the church president, that he talked about flooding the earth with the Book of Mormon, the church's fundamental book of Scripture. But what's lost in this conversation is that he really was an influential leader in the post-war United States. He was a two-time presidential candidate. Those candidacies had never taken off. But nonetheless, he was recruited to run for the U.S. presidency on two different occasions in the 1960s. He's also, I found in my research, one of the most prominent anti-communist spokespersons of the day. And it wasn't just inundating Latter-day Saint audiences with screeds against communism. He was speaking to dental groups, an apostle speaking to dental groups. Who would have thought? He's speaking to evangelical Bible camps. He's speaking in large coliseums, like one in Los Angeles. So he's really projecting himself as a leading clergyman's voice in this fight against communism. And then lastly, of course, I think most folks would recognize him as an influential Latter-day Saint apostle and church president. But he's so important for his day that you can see on the right here in 1989 that President Bush awards Ezra Taft Benson the Presidential Citizens Medal, which is the second highest award that the U.S. government bestows. So somebody thinks highly of him. And let's unpack his life this hour. Well, before we get going, I'm asked frequently, so I just put this slide in for tonight, but I'm asked frequently, where do you get your source material from? And as a historian, sources are our best friend. We rely on sources, we rely on archivists, and you can see that there's a number of sources. I've been privileged to travel around the country. I'll tell you one quick little funny anecdote. Some of the time I wasn't planning on going, like to Wisconsin, for example, but my son had a club basketball game there, and I realized I've got 3 hours in between games. There's got to be something in the Wisconsin Historical Society to see. And lo and behold, there's a big Benson file there. Who would have known? So I come into my son's game 15 minutes late. He's at the free throw line. Dad, where are you at? I've got a packet of Benson stuff. Anyway, the most important, or one of the most important files up here, in addition to the church history archives that house the Benson papers, would of course be the Eisenhower Presidential Library. It's a treasure trove of documents. The Benson family had donated papers. The first installment was in the late 1990s, just 5 years after Benson had died, and the second installment was in 2003. And it's really an extraordinary collection. Well, there's 3 events that changed Ezra Taft Benson's life. He was a farm boy, grew up in Whitney, Idaho. He really was born into poverty, didn't have a lot of money. It's kind of trite to say poverty, rural Idaho, right? Nobody has any money. It's like asking somebody from rural Idaho, how did the Depression affect you? And the answer is, what depression? We were poor before it, we were poor during it, we were poor after it. Well, Benson makes his hay in life through farm cooperatives. And because of his farm cooperative work, he goes to Washington, D.C., where he will get noticed working in these farm cooperatives. Well, he's called as an LDS Church apostle in 1943, and 3 years later, there's something that happens in his life that will forever change him. He is called to go to post-war Europe to help rehabilitate the Latter-day Saints there who've been suffering from the war. So he goes to Europe in 1946. He wasn't their first choice. They had 2 other apostles they had asked to do it. One was sick and the other one wasn't really nuts about doing it. And so Elder Benson, as a junior apostle, couldn't say no. He had young children at home. It was an incredible sacrifice to leave your home for a year with young children. And while he was away, some of his fellow apostles in the Quorum of the 12, they had taken care of his wife and his children. So they were sort of the surrogate patriarchs while Ezra Taft Benson was away. The second event that changes his life is his service in Dwight Eisenhower's cabinet. He's the first church apostle to serve, first and only church apostle to serve in a presidential cabinet. I'm going to explore these themes in just a moment. And then finally, the third most important event in his life would be his affiliation with the president and founder of the most radical anti-communist organization of the day. It's called the John Birch Society. And I got access to Ezra Taft Benson's Birch files in Appleton, Wisconsin. And really an amazing trove of documents for a scholar. Well, Benson, when he got back from, or when he was church president in 1989, he published a book called A Labor of Love. And it's essentially a collection of his diaries and some letters that he had written to his wife Flora when he was in Europe during that year-long absence. And his missionary companion, a guy named Frederick Babel, also wrote a memoir later on called On the Wings of Faith. And both of these books will become bestsellers for the day because Latter-day Saints are intensely interested in their experiences during World War II. You can see from this slide here, there's Frederick Babel on the right. He's a young man. I think he's married at the time. He's got one small child. He's early 30s. And Ezra Taft Benson at this point would have been about 47. So Benson's a little over a decade older than his missionary companion, Frederick Babel. They had never met before. And somebody had recommended Babel to go with him to Europe. It wasn't Benson's recommendation. And I want to tell you a quick anecdote about Benson that deals with Frederick Babel. Before Babel was, as he was preparing for his time in Europe with this apostle, he was given some counsel by another apostle, and the apostle said, don't counsel him unless he asks. Which is a strange thing to say if you're his missionary companion. That's what you do. You counsel, right? But he said, don't counsel him. He's very intense, and he'll take everything you say seriously. That gives you a little snapshot into Benson's personality and temperament. He's an intense person. And one of his colleagues in the Quorum of the 12 had recognized as such and counseled against it. Look at this last quote. It gives you a small snapshot of what Elder Benson does. He wrote his wife when he was in Europe, and he said, quote, I'm so grateful that you and the children can be spared the views of the terrible ravages of war. I fear I'll never be able to erase them from my memory. And Benson wrote that to his wife after he had been visiting various concentration camps throughout Eastern Europe. You can imagine how descriptive his diary entries are. Also his letters to the First Presidency reporting about his mission. Also his letters to his wife and his children. He's talking about these war-ravaged Latter-day Saints who are scrambling for food in the streets, as he wrote, looking for their next meal. And he's really just crushed by the amount of suffering. On another occasion, he told his wife, he said, if I hadn't experienced this with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it was true. And if any of you have studied his sermons over the years, both as a leader, and you'll know that he frequently talks about his experience in Europe. It really is one of those defining moments in his life. Well, in the fall of 1952, Benson gets word from his cousin, the Ohio senator, a guy named Robert Taft, who's not a Latter-day Saint, but he's intensely conservative. He's one of the most influential senators in the U.S. Senate in the mid-20th century. And he gets word from Robert Taft that this new president-elect, you know him as Dwight Eisenhower, he's looking for an agricultural secretary, and he wants somebody from the Midwest or the West, and he wants somebody who's a clergyman. I recommended you. Now Benson, of course, is intrigued by this. This wasn't the first rodeo that he'd had with this. In 1948, Thomas Dewey, the moderate governor from New York, had proposed him to be his agricultural secretary should he defeat Truman in the 48 election, which didn't happen. But Benson was really, really intrigued by this. He'd only been in the Quorum of the 12 for 5 years, and here we have a government official who's calling and saying, come to my cabinet. And Benson's intrigued, and he received permission from George Albert Smith, who was the church president, that if Dewey wins, then I'll grant permission for a leave of absence. And so Benson's really, really intrigued by this, so much so that he takes his good friend, a guy named Ernest Wilkinson. If you've been to BYU, he's got his fingerprints all over that campus, even still. But Ernest Wilkinson and Ezra Taft Benson, they go to the Commodore Hotel in downtown New York City, where they watch the election results. This is Dewey's headquarters, campaign headquarters. They watch the election returns come in, and they're just absolutely crushed when they don't win. So Benson goes back to Salt Lake, he resumes his duties as a member of the Quorum of the 12, and then in 1952 there's another opportunity that arises, and he gets permission from David O. McKay, the church president, who had become the president in 1951 when George Albert Smith died. Look at his diary here. I can tell you about this, but when I speak to Latter-day Saint groups, I always think it's really, really important that you see for yourself what's being said, as opposed to me just paraphrasing it or even reading it. And in the David O. McKay Journal, he said that we set Elder Benson apart as the Secretary of Agriculture. If we had more time tonight, we would unpack what that means to set somebody apart in a secular position. I mean, use your imagination. The church president's blending church and state here. But really, the second part of the blessing gives it away. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read it all tonight, but I'll just simply say that when President McKay and his counselor, a guy named Reuben Clark, who is enormously influential on Ezra Taft Benson's life, when they set him apart, they warn him, they urge him that he may be fearless in the condemnation of these subversive influences and strong in your defense of the rights and privileges of the Constitution. Ezra Taft Benson will get this calling or this blessing, and it'll be his marching call as an apostle for the rest of his life. He is to guard against communism and socialism and liberalism and any other ism that you can think of. That's how he interprets his calling. Every apostle in the church has a calling, some with temples, some with this, some with that. His calling is to warn against big government. At least that's what he interprets it as. You know, it's so easy to just talk about people in a vacuum, right? But as historians and as religious thinkers, we have to always contextualize who these folks are and be fair to them and sort of meet them on their own terms. It's so easy to criticize and condemn, you know, the 21st century. And in Benson's case, we have to look at how the Cold War just absolutely affects every facet of his life. Just to give you a little synopsis of the Cold War, is that Ezra Taft Benson is called into the Quorum of the 12 just a few years before the Cold War begins. And he dies in 1994, just a few years after it ends. The Cold War overshadows everything about his church ministry, from the time that he's an apostle to the time that he's the church president. And when he went to Washington, D.C. in January of 1953 to take up his duties as the Secretary of Agriculture, there's a Red Scare going on. And you can see the guy on the right, who's really sucking the oxygen out of the room, a guy named Joseph McCarthy. They had these senatorial ranking services. They still do them today. And they had, the senatorial ranking service had ranked Joseph McCarthy the 100th most effective senator in the country. Now that's not very good. That's like the person homeschooled, right? You know, my mother made me valedictorian. I had that happen once, so I didn't make that up. How many people in your graduating class? Well, just me. Okay, congratulations anyway. Well, Senator McCarthy was the 100th most effective senator, and he needs a platform. And what a better platform to have than to accuse all people and any people of being a communist, including the U.S. military, which, as most of you know, students of history, will lead to his downfall. But also, too, the Korean War is winding down. He's coming into the cabinet during a war. Also, too, he comes into the cabinet just a few years after a husband and wife team were executed for espionage. There's a lot of stuff going on here, too. And I always tell people that in the midst of this Cold War, I'm not going to defend McCarthy. The guy's nuts. I mean, he's nuts, and that's all there is to it. But Ezra Taft Benson is influenced by him, and Benson will write, at least by my count, 4 different letters in his life where he'll tell his friends that the first communist cell in the U.S. government happened in my shop, the the Agricultural Department, in the 1930s. A guy named Alger Hiss. That happened in my shop. I want to make sure it's not going to happen under my direction. If you know his story at all, he was convicted of trading secrets to the Soviets, and he went to his death in 1996, denying that he ever did anything. This is more time than we have tonight, but scholars are divided over whether or not there was a connection. And there were some good people on both sides of the debate, that when the Soviet archives opened up post-Cold War, that there was smoking guns, as one scholar said, that links Alger Hiss with the Soviets. And then there's some other scholars who push back on that. So, but nonetheless, for Benson, Alger Hiss was real. Well, when he's in Washington, there are 2 influences that really, really overwhelm him. These are the 2 biggest ones. There are some others, but these are the two big ones. And the one on the left is J. Edgar Hoover, who was the long-standing FBI director. He came into the Bureau in 1922, and so he'd been in there quite a while by the time Benson came in. And Benson was worried about his reputation when he came into the government. And he demanded that J. Edgar Hoover do a background check on him. And Hoover wrote him, he said, that's not required. We don't do this. Benson said, I want it done anyway. And so they interviewed his fellow associates in the Quorum of the 12. They interviewed the church president. They interviewed his former associates in farmers' cooperatives. And J. Edgar Hoover and his associates gave Ezra Taft Benson a sterling review. He's a magnificent speaker, his friends note. He's a man of high moral character. He loves his country. He's a patriot. This is what his FBI file is saying. And this, of course, lets Benson say to everybody, I'm legit. I'm not one of those subversive influences in the government. I've been vetted, even before they did those kinds of things in those days. Well, anyway, on page 93 of Masters of Deceit, this is the book that J. Edgar Hoover has his name on but did not write. Isn't that the case with high-profile, busy people? You know, they want to say they wrote it, they didn't write it. Anyway, some lower-level operatives in the Bureau wrote it. Well, this page 93 is a sentence that Benson quotes often in his private letters to his friends. Quote, many persons, including high-ranking statesmen, public officials, educators, ministers of the gospel, professional men, have been duped into helping communism. And Benson gets a lot of mileage out of this. Everybody's a communist, even people in the gospel. And by the gospel, of course, talking about ministers. But Benson will take it a step further, and as we'll see in a minute, maybe we won't see in a minute, maybe this will be Q&A. But Benson will accuse one of his associates in high church leadership, a guy named Hubie Brown, of being a socialist. These two do not like each other. Oh my goodness. It'd be nice to go to a restaurant with them and just listen to them talk. The other person that, that Benson is influenced by is a person who he had met when he was a state president, Benson, in Washington, D.C. This is before, of course, he was a member of the 12. And Cleon Skousen worked for the FBI. And so Ezra Taft Benson had called him into, I think he was the state Sunday school president in those days, as they called it. And so that's where they met. And in 1958, Skousen rather, wrote a book on communism the same year that Masters of Deceit came out. And these two books were really the seminal anti-communist tracts of the day. Time magazine, Life magazine, they're touting them up. And what makes Skousen a superstar overnight wasn't the fact that Life and Time magazine were talking about his book on communism. It's the fact that the church president, David O. McKay, himself an ardent anti-communist, endorses it in General Conference in 1959. And so the book, as one Latter-day Saint intellectual, a guy named Dick Paul, he said, when President McKay talked about this book in conference and urged all the saints to read it, it became canonized, on par with the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. So there's some hyperbole going on here, but you get the point, that Mormons are taking this book seriously. So much so that they're even bringing it to church and sacrament meeting and worship services, and they're touting Skousen's book. There's a whole bunch of stuff in the book that I don't know, it's really, if you're having a bad night, you want to read something to perk you up and make you laugh, go read that book. Some of the assertions and the claims in there are just really, really, they're incredible. It's how to write a book without evidence. Anyway, so when Benson's in the agricultural department, he learns that there's a man in the State Department, a Ukrainian-born Jew, spent some time in Russia. But Wolf Legimsky had served in the State Department under a guy named John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State. And he had served meritoriously. They loved his service, but they thought his skill set was better suited for the agricultural department, so they wanted to move him over to Secretary Benson's shop. And the fact that he was a Ukrainian-born Jew who still had family behind the Iron Curtain, it was a perfect storm. That this was a communist in Benson's eyes, and we had to get rid of him. And this happens early on, and it creates a huge public relations debacle for the Eisenhower administration, because now you have one of your own cabinet members accusing somebody without evidence of being a communist, and then of course the press picks up on it, and they just beat up on Ezra Taft Benson. Remember I told you a minute ago that I went to Wisconsin during my son's basketball game, just to mess around in the archives? Well, the archival file that was there was one of the journalists who pummeled Secretary Benson, a guy named Clark Mullinoff, writes just a lot of these angry, I don't know about angry, but really aggressive screeds against Secretary Benson. How could he do this? He's just McCarthy light. He doesn't know what he's doing. There's no evidence. And Elder Benson, or Secretary Benson, he would tell a journalist, he would say, you just have to trust me. It's in an FBI file that you are not permitted to see. Now, this appeal to authority does not work well with people who want to see evidence, and including me. And so what did I do? Well, I filed the Freedom of Information Act. I wanted to see Wolf Leginsky's file. What is in this file? You can see the top right-hand document that I highlighted. After the FBI did a thorough investigation of his alleged ties to communism, you can see it says, favorable determination. He's not a communist. And what I didn't tell you was that Wolf Leginsky had written, he has a PhD in economics, agricultural economics. He had written several articles attacking the collective system. And so for Secretary Benson to claim that he was sympathetic towards communism was just really not understanding what he had been writing over the previous 3 decades. Anyway, so Dwight Eisenhower's press secretary, James Haggerty, he said something interesting. Benson is very stubborn and refuses to admit that he made a mistake. And Reed Benson, his son, wrote years later, the liberal press had come after my father. That's always Reed Benson's line, you know, the liberal press came after my father, it seems like, his go-to. But anyway, so Elder Benson, or Secretary Benson, never apologized for this. And even in his memoirs that were published in 1962, he still stuck to his guns that Leginsky was a communist, even though there wasn't one scintilla. There's no evidence. And anyway, it's one of those, I guess, stubborn streaks of Secretary Benson's personality. But that's Wolf Leginsky. And Wolf Leginsky is the only casualty of Ezra Taft Benson's surveillance system. He's the only one. It didn't go very well. It was a public relations disaster, as I mentioned. And they reassigned him he couldn't stay with Secretary Benson, so they reassigned him somewhere else in the government. But Wolf Leginsky died, I think, in 1975, and he was quite angry because his skill set was suited towards the agricultural department, but yet he wasn't welcome there. Benson was growing up on a farm in a community. He was intensely conservative, and Benson didn't like the New Deal, as you can imagine. The New Deal, of course, was the government program that Franklin Roosevelt had created during the Great Depression. And as I teach my students in Colorado, Franklin Roosevelt creates the welfare state, the modern welfare state, and all that that entails. And later on, of course, the welfare state will explode under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. But Ezra Taft Benson does not like the welfare state, doesn't like the New Deal, doesn't like Franklin Roosevelt. And so when he's the agricultural secretary, he has to deal with some of the farm subsidies that were created during the New Deal. And what was really interesting doing some research in this is, of course, Latter-day Saints, they're farmers. And you can see a woman from Logan, Utah. She writes one of Benson's mentors, a very powerful man named J. Reuben Clark. He'd been in the first presidency since 1933 under Heber J. Grant. And he was retained on in the first presidency through George Albert Smith and also through David O. McKay. Well, a woman from Logan wrote, what does the church's stand with regards to the actions of Secretary Benson? Our faith is certainly being tested. Cutting our dairy subsidies will cost the farmers millions of dollars, and I don't think our farm can withstand such drastic measures. That's what he proposed to do, to severely curtail farm subsidies. If your domestic economy is predicated upon these farm subsidies, you're worried. And J. Reuben Clark wrote back, and he just said, you know, what he does as a government official is what he does. I only have control over him as a church official. And that's something separate. And I'm certain that woman wasn't very happy with that response, but that was probably the most prudent response that Clark could give. One last thought about this. Benson's farm policies are so controversial. Farmers will show up and throw eggs at him when he's speaking, just like I'm speaking. They're heckling him, they're throwing eggs. I've got a story where a guy throws his shoe at him. There are, just pause for a moment. He's an LDS Church apostle. He has never been addressed this way before. No one throws eggs at LDS Church apostles. No one pushes back in the way that these folks are doing. They don't throw their shoes at them. They don't cuss at them. They don't heckle them. And that's what's going on with Benson. All right, and there's more I can say about this. But keep that in the back of your minds about how he's treated when he's the secretary. I'm going to go through this pretty quick because I want to get to some other slides. But one of his aides said that Benson was so laissez-faire. If you want to understand my boss's mentality, look at Adam Smith and Joseph Smith, the two Smiths, and there you have it. One is a religious figure, and the other one's, of course, the father of capitalism. And there's a great story that a governor from Texas wrote Secretary Benson, "We're having a drought. We need help. Our farmers need help." What he's saying is, give us some subsidies. Benson wrote back, "I'll pray for rain." That gives you a small sense about how he approaches these kinds of things. Well, in 1961, after he left the cabinet, Ezra Taft Benson met somebody that will forever change his life. You can see him at the top right-hand corner. His name is Robert Welch. They're the same age. Both of them were born in 1899. Robert Welch was born in North Carolina. We use the word genius a lot. I think it's kind of cliche-ish and maybe even trite, but Robert Welch is a genius. He's got a photographic memory. He went to Harvard Law School and lasted, I think, a year and a half. And he clashed with one of the most cantankerous of the law professors at the time, a guy named Felix Frankfurter, who was every bit as stubborn as Robert Welch was. Well, anyway, Robert Welch dropped out of law school, worked for the Mars Candy Corporation, and the Sugar Daddy Lollipop, you guys know that one? That's Robert Welch. I remember eating this little caramel lollipop as a kid. Robert Welch and his company created that caramel lollipop, and it made him millions. So he retired as a young man in the 1950s and decided that he would focus his energy on fighting communism. So he founds this group called the John Birch Society, named after a fallen soldier during World War II. And Reed Benson, Ezra Taft Benson's son, will work for the John Birch Society throughout the 1960s and into the early 70s. Well, Ezra Taft Benson is absolutely mesmerized by Robert Welch. You can look at, you can see some of the conspiracy theories that Welch will talk about. I'll show you the book in a minute. It's called The Politician. But Robert Welch he claims that Dwight Eisenhower, a 5-star general, is a communist. And not just Eisenhower, but his brother Milton Eisenhower, a close confidant and advisor to his brother. Also John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, and his brother Allen Dulles, who was head of the Central Intelligence Agency. So Benson's reading what Welch is saying, and he believes it. And I want you guys just to think for a moment about how could you do that? You could serve with somebody for 8 years. You know darn well that Ike is not a commie. Why would you believe this stuff? I want to come back to that theme. Other public figures who are communists are Dr. King and LBJ and Rachel Carson, Chief Justice Earl Warren. The UN's run by communist sympathizers. I mean, this is a communist lens that is starting to develop in Ezra Taft Benson's worldview that will profoundly affect the church throughout his ministry. You can see one of Ezra Taft Benson's close friends, a fellow Idahoan, a guy named Harold Lee. He said, quote, "Anyone who didn't agree with Brother Benson's mind was indeed a communist." Obviously some hyperbole there, but Harold Lee knew that his friend, Elder Benson, had strong views about government. This is the Birch Society. This is the book where Robert Welch had articulated these conspiratorial things about Eisenhower. And when Benson read this book, when I got the FBI, or not the FBI files, the John Birch Society files from Appleton, Wisconsin, one of the things I was interested in seeing is Benson had sent letters to each member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and he bought them this book. You got to read this book. It will change your life. He also bought, I found in the big stack of documents they gave me, I found receipts from the church archives. We call it the LDS Church History Library today. Those days it was just called the church archives. Well, he bought copies of The Politician for the church archives because he wanted Latter-day Saints to have access to this book when they went to church headquarters to do research. And so Benson got pushed back. There was a first presidency counselor, a guy named Henry Moyle, who was a Democrat, a conservative Democrat. And Henry Moyle got a copy of The Politician, And he called Ezra Taft Benson into his office. And he said, "How could you do this, Taft?" That's the nickname they called him. "How could you do this, Taft? How could you be so disloyal to your former boss?" And he reproved him. And President Royal said something interesting. He said, "Don't worry, I won't take you off any of your committees. You can stay." And that was his way of saying, "I'm chastising you, but I'm not doing all that I could do to punish you." Anyway, well, the John Birch Society is interesting because there's this problem in the Republican Party. You've got extremists in the Republican Party. You don't want to lose their vote, but on the other hand, you don't want to actively court them. And so it becomes this interesting political phenomenon that Barry Goldwater and some other Republican leaders have to deal with in the 1960s with the John Birch Society. One of the things that Benson does by 1969 is that he publishes this is his most famous book called Emmy Haddamnes. And I put the table of contents to the right for you to see it. It's just Birch literature writ large. You look at chapter 14, the United Nations, a planned tyranny. I mean, he was anti-UN all the way. Number 13, civil rights, a tool of communist deception. And it just goes on and on and on. And what's interesting about this book is that I haven't been able to see the first draft, but when the first presidency reviewed it, they made him take out a lot of stuff. And knowing what's in the final draft, it just blows my mind to think about what could have been removed from the first draft. Civil rights, I'll say a quick word about civil rights. One of the biggest issues for Ezra Taft Benson was civil rights. Like a lot of Southern clergymen at the time, he didn't believe in racial equality. And one of the things, I'm finishing a big book now, massive book on the church in black since World War II. I go into a lot of detail about civil rights, about investigations at BYU for alleged civil rights violations. It's really interesting stuff. But Ezra Taft Benson followed the Birch line by using this placard on the left to besmirch Dr. King's name. And if you guys know anything about this background, this is the Highlander Folk School in Montego, Tennessee. This is the who's who of civil rights training. You would go there, including a woman that you've all heard of, Rosa Parks. We'll spend some time there. You can see Dr. King, a very young man, Dr. King, and he's sitting next to a communist, or a former member of the Communist Party. And the person who took this photo knew that. And the operative word is former. And they're going to use this to besmirch Dr. King's reputation. And what's interesting about this placard is that not only will the Birch Society distribute this, but Ezra Taft Benson will distribute it to his friends, and Cleon Skousen will distribute it. Well, Benson felt so strongly about civil rights that he ran for the presidency with two known segregationists, a guy named George Wallace and Strom Thurmond. And neither of the tickets materialized, but gives you a small sense of where he was going. All right, I'm looking at my time here. How are we doing on time, Matt? Okay. We're doing okay.
You got 40 minutes.
Okay. All right, so this is civil rights. Well, there's a lot more we could say about civil rights, but let me just make one point that I think is important. There are a lot of people, Republicans in particular, who oppose civil rights, but not because they think Dr. King is a communist. Barry Goldwater opposes civil rights and will later recant. He'll express remorse. Barry Goldwater rejected civil rights for federal reasons. He didn't want the federal government to create some apparatus that would have to go into the South and oversee voting. That's much different than articulating or advancing this idea that Dr. King's a communist. So Ezra Taft Benson is definitely adopting a view that is in the minority of his own party. I think that's really, really important to know. Even the most conservative Republicans at the time, guys like Barry Goldwater, do not think that Dr. King is a communist. In fact, Barry Goldwater got a copy of The Politician, and he told his friend, he said, if you were smart, you would burn every copy you have, because he recognized how volatile this could be to their party. I'm going to go through this slide pretty quick, because I want to get us to the modern day, you guys. I think most of us have heard in this room, perhaps, if those of you who are Latter-day Saints, you've heard that Ezra Taft Benson said you can't be a good Mormon and a good Democrat. I get asked that all frequently, in fact. When did he first say this? Well, he said it first in the 1930s. He's been touting this for a long time. You can't be a good Latter-day Saint and be a good Democrat. which is a very strange thing to say, since Heber J. Grant, the church president who called him in as an apostle, was a conservative Democrat. Henry Moyle, the first presidency, was a Democrat. Hugh B. Brown was a Democrat. And here you have Elder Benson saying that you can't be a good Latter-day Saint and a good Democrat. You can imagine that it creates a lot of hardship. And Spencer W. Kimball's journal had an interesting entry after Benson had given this interview in 1974 with the Salt Lake Tribune, in which he said that you can't be a good Democrat, a good Mormon. Kimball said, a number of people came in to deplore what Brother Benson said. I counseled him that all the general authorities must speak with one voice and that we cannot take any partisan position in politics, candidates, or parties. And even though the church president had chastised him, he did it again a few months later too. It didn't change Elder Benson at all. Now, remember back that blessing in 1952. Your job is to warn against the dangers in government. And Elder Benson always harkened back to that blessing that President McKay had given him. This is a famous address that President Elder Benson gave at BYU in 1980. And you can see I've highlighted, in the interest of time, I've highlighted two parts of the address. I remember going to BYU and I studied this in a class called Teachings of the Living Prophets. Number 3, the living prophet is more important than a dead prophet. And number 10, the prophet may advise on civic matters. This address, just like that, will just absolutely anger a lot of Mormon liberals because they see this as Elder Benson's rise to the presidency. Spencer Kimball is not in good health this time. We know that he dies 5 years later, but they didn't know that at that time. And critics of Elder Benson thought that this was his way of saying, when I become the church president soon, I am going to speak for the church. I am going to urge that we all vote for one candidate over another. That's what they're fearful of. And also, of course, linking the church with the John Birch Society. Well, you know, oftentimes people will say, oh, President Benson softened when he was the church president. And I always say to that, we need to footnote that. He didn't soften because he wanted to. He softened because he had associates in church leadership who reined him in. It starts with Harold B. Lee, it continues with Spencer Kimball, and it goes on with Gordon Hinckley. And just pause for a moment and think about something. I want to just do a little thought experiment for you. Can you imagine, after Spencer W. Kimball's historic revelation lifting the priesthood and temple ban, trying to go into black African countries, and you've got a senior apostle calling the civil rights leaders a bunch of commies? That's not good for business. Can you imagine having a senior apostle continue talking about and equating socialism and liberalism with communism and with Satan? That's not good for business in Northern Europe. And Spencer Kimball knows this. Spencer Kimball knows this. So anyway, if you want, there's lots of proof I could give you, but if you want some proof that politics is still so much alive in President Benson's mind as church president, look at this letter, January 6, 1986. If you just Google, when did he become the church president? It was a couple months before that. One of the first things he does is he writes the Birch people and he says, can you send some Birch magazine, you can see it on the right here, called The New American. Can you send it to my counselors, Gordon Hinckley, Tom Monson, and my secretary, Arthur Aycock? And the Birch founder told me something interesting. He said that they canceled their subscriptions right away. I said, well, why? And the Birch guy told me, because the counselors didn't want this. They didn't want our stuff. I said, I could have told you that. Anyway, so Elder Benson's controversial. There's a number of things just in the interest of time, but the church is trying to modernize during his presidency. And what's interesting is they're trying to modernize while he's still alive. In the early 1990s, Gordon B. Hinckley will give an order to one of the lower level general authorities in Utah and Idaho, instructing them to go around the church. These are the biggest pockets of Benson devotees in Cleon's Council. Go around the church and tell these people that if they subscribe or adhere to the principles of the Birch Society, they could be considered in apostasy. Now, this is 1992. President Benson's still alive. He's non-compos mentis at this point. He's got feeding tubes up in his body. He's not doing well. He can't speak. But this is going on while he's still alive. They're trying to rein in right-wing extremism. In 1992, they lead a pretty good purge where they get rid of these survivalists and these birch people. They excommunicate them, which is kind of interesting. Sometimes in the church, we tend to think that they just go after liberals. This is a prime example of going after people on the far right. There's a lot of influence that just briefly touch on these things in the time that we have left. But here's an interesting story here with Tara Westover. I'm sure a number of you have read this book. It's a bestseller. It's really, if you haven't, it's worth reading. But I remember reading it, and I thought, oh my goodness, hardly mentions the church at all. I know she's LDS because she said she was. And I also know that she said she didn't want to talk about the church. But as I'm reading it, and my wife read it, oh wow, there are lots of ideas that resonate with me here. Anti-UN, Dr. King's a commie, all of these things. So I wrote Tara Westover an email, and I said, I play stupid. Who's your father reading? Who's influencing him? Like, I don't know. She wrote back, he loves Ezra Taft Benson and Cleon Skousen. And so she confirmed that those two authors loom large in her family's home. These are the Bundy brothers, or the Bundy father and the two brothers. Clive and Bundy, the elder, you guys remember from a couple of years ago when they led that month-long standoff in Oregon, claiming a conspiracy to take away, government conspiracy to take away state and local lands. Well, Clive and Bundy, the father, was a member of the American Independent Party of Utah in the 1970s. And the party was founded upon one of Ezra Taft Benson's sermons, and called this proper sphere of government. Anyway, Elder Benson had left the Republican Party because of civil rights. His party became too cozy in the 1968 election with civil rights, and so he just decided he had enough. And he became a member of the American Independent Party, and was there for about 13 years until his friend Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. Anyway, so there's lots of influences that deal with Ezra Taft Benson today. You can see Glenn Beck, convert to the church. He was a CNN commentator for a long time. He used to regularly tout Cleon Skousen, Ezra Taft Benson on his program. Obviously, their political views had resonated with him personally. More recently, we see a shadow of Elder Benson with some of these conspiracy theories that is gripping the church today. You can see that a poll that was done not terribly long ago, that 25% of white evangelical Protestants, 26% of Hispanic Protestants, and 18% of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they say that the government, the media, and financial worlds in the U.S. are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. This is a huge problem for the church. I read on Facebook recently this young returned missionary. She got off her mission, and her bishop was bearing testimony about these things right here, that he knew that there was this child trafficking ring, and Democrats were satanic. And she said, I knew in my heart this was false. If he's saying this kind of thing over the pulpit and bearing his testimony, what else is he saying that could be false? That's the last thing you want one of your ecclesiastical leaders to be doing in a worship service. Well, it's a problem. You don't put things in the handbook unless it's a problem. And in December of 2018, they revised the church handbook, and you can see the first paragraph that the first presidency, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, they're counseling Latter-day Saints to avoid sources that seek to promote anger, contention, fear, or baseless conspiracy theories. And I should add that poll that I just did, or showed you a minute ago, happened just before this. You can't help but think that this is QAnon you're talking about. Maybe you just put QAnon in brackets, right? Anyway, so it's a huge issue. The leaders are talking about it. January 6th, we've got proof that there are some Latter-day Saints that are involved in these QAnon conspiracy theories. This young man here was a returned missionary, or is a returned missionary, went to BYU, Idaho, in Rexburg, and he's famous. We all saw him on the news, the guy that is scaling the building. I just thought, I was looking at this slide today, I just noticed the Latin term, anuncoptus, if I said that right. Anyway, God has favored our undertakings, which is really strange. Maybe he thinks God is supporting him in this respect, who knows. And then this is my favorite slide. We've got Captain Moroni who shows up. Ezra Taft Benson frequently talked about Captain Moroni in his sermons. And so you can see that he's inside the building here. Captain Moroni is from Arizona, and he's going through the court system now, as is the other student or person. Anyway, few last slides. I want to do some Q&A. So the church, of course, is worried about right-wing extremism. They've been worried about this for a long, long time in the church. They're trying to modernize, to try to get away from the right-wing perception that many people have of Latter-day Saints. So the church wasted very little time in condemning the January 6th Capitol attack. You can see that here. Also, the church has been sensitive to racial unrest, given the church's own checkered past with race and the priesthood ban, its own anti-black theology. And first counselor, President Dallin Oaks, gave a speech at BYU in the fall of 2020. I love I love the speech for one, but for two, I love what KBYU did with the banner here. As he was talking, they put Black Lives Matter. And I found that really heartening. Then more recently, you can see Church President Russell Nelson clasping arms with the minister and / head of the NAACP in Northern California, a guy named Amos Brown. The church, I'm sure some of you know this, the church has done really some nice work with the NAACP, helping them fund some issues, restore some buildings. So the church is trying to do things to make up for lost time. Imagine this for a moment, that if Ezra Taft Benson were alive, he would never be in this picture. One of the reasons why he would never be in this picture is because he called the NAACP communists. Not just Dr. King, but he called the NAACP communists. This would be so anathema to his worldview. There's no way that he could conceptualize some of his successors in church leadership cozying up to a group that he thought were aligned with the Soviet Republic. And then just a couple last slides. This is a sermon that President Oaks gave in April of 2021. This is another, I don't want to use the word veiled threat, but essentially this is Benson. You don't have to belong to one party. There's not one party in the church that has all the truth. He's talking about the Republican Party. And Dallin Oaks understands as well as anybody in the church that the dangers of having a one-party church. They understand that evangelicals have been too cozy with Republicans, and they've struggled with their image as a result. And then lastly, the last slide I want to share with you is just his legacy in the church. That Benson frequently talked about these insidious forces in the government as being part of a deep state, or part of a secret combinations, as he called it. But today's Latter-day Saints call it the deep state. It's the same thing. They're just two heads of the same coin. But there are sinister, corrupt influences within the government seeking to erode our rights and liberties. And Latter-day Saints are, at least some Latter-day Saints are picking up on that. Benson's besmirch of the Democratic Party is still with us today. You can see that 70% of today's Latter-day Saints in the U.S. identify as Republican. That's a problem if you're trying to missionize and bring other people into the church, and yet the perception is that you have to be a conservative and you have to be a Republican in order to be a Latter-day Saint. The church is trying so very hard to shed this image. And they started, just a quick story, they started in the 1990s with this. They had a lower level general authority named Marlin Jensen, a Democrat, who was involved in Utah politics. And Gordon B. Hinckley, who was then the church president, he told Jensen, go talk to the press and let them know that you can be a Democrat. And he did it. And you can see the result. Didn't change a thing. Here we are years later, and still 70% of the saints think that you have to be a Republican. And then lastly, the most difficult part of Elder Benson's legacy is the influence that he's had on right-wing extremists in the church. And we just touched on a few here tonight, but there are so many more. Now, I want to just pause for a moment. I've read tons of his talks, his speeches, his private letters. I've read his diaries. He's never called for violence. Never, ever, ever. He wasn't a violent man. But this is a classic example of how people could read your work and co-opt them for whatever purposes you want to co-opt them for. But what I do want to argue, though, tonight is that Benson does plant seeds. And what's interesting is that some of my BYU friends who teach political science, they get interviewed, as do I, the same venues. they always have me on as sort of a counterpoint to that when they talk about Mormon extremism. And my BYU political science friends will say that if you want to understand why Latter-day Saints are conspiracy theorists or whatever, look at the Republican Party. Look at how they identify. And that's true. It's true. The Republican Party is a big part of the way that Latter-day Saints view the world today, at least those who identify as Republican. But the other part of the equation is we would be remiss to overlook the seeds that Elder Benson and his Franklin on Skousen plant. And these same people who claim that there's a conspiracy, that the election was stolen, these are the same people who will also tout up Ezra Taft Benson's writings. Thank you. All right, so I told Matt I wanted to speak for just around an hour or so, and I think I accomplished that. So I'm going to do some Q&A if you have questions about anything you've heard tonight. Yeah?
I have a bunch of questions. One is one. So it just sounds like Ezra Taft Benson is kind of like the outlier within his, contemporary apostles. Like, he sent these magazines, they didn't want them. He was a contemporary with Spencer W. Kimball, which is like, we think of him as the apostle that we talk about expanding the priesthood, and yet they're like in the same group. Was he the outlier, or were there others that were on par with his kind of political views and views of how church and state mesh together?
That's a great question. So I want to make a really important distinction tonight, and I hope it's clear. I think I alluded to it, but I want to further highlight it, which is there's a big, big difference between being a conservative and extremist, right? So the extremism would be Dr. King's a communist, and let's not support civil rights. The conservative would be Senator Goldwater, let's not support civil rights because it'll create a government monster, another bureaucracy. Most of the leaders of the church are conservative doctrinally and politically, but there is no evidence that any of the apostles agree with his views about Dr. King and all of that stuff. And they support anti-communism. But what they're really upset about is there are so many Latter-day Saints who are criticizing the church. They would write the First Presidency. They would say stuff like, Elder Benson just spoke at our state conference last week, and all he talked about was Lyndon Johnson and Earl Warren were communists. I don't go to church for this. And so it puts President McKay and Huey Brown and the other counselor and Ellen Tanner in a tough spot, because you've got this apostle who feels like he's been called by God to do this, but yet it's dividing the church. And so President McKay was very conservative, but even he told Benson, you got to cool it with the bird stuff. So I hope that answers your question. There isn't anybody in the 12 that supports his Birch views. There are some lower level general authority 70s who do though, but none in the upper leadership that I can see. Yeah.
I want to go back to the doctrinal basis of Benson being set apart to be the Secretary of Ag. The closest thing I've seen to that is when Holland came down and dedicated the entire multi-religious building at Chapman University, dedicated the whole thing, not just one room. But I've never seen someone set apart for such a secular job. What's the doctrinal basis of doing that when it had nothing directly to do with the church?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a doctrinal basis as much as that this is the time in church history, the mid-20th century, where the church is trying to shed its 19th century polygamous past and all the things that made the church weird, right? So the church is using Elder Benson's high-profile position as a missionary tool. And when the apostles wrote him letters, almost every letter they wrote, you're doing us proud. We're getting these positive notes into Salt Lake about what's going on with you and your example and that of your family. And so they're looking at it, it's not so much a doctrinal thing as much as it's just a tool to ingratiate the church into the larger Christian mainstream, if you will. And I told you guys about how Benson It was controversial. They're throwing eggs at him. Well, people pick up on this. And after the first term in office, David O. McKay flew to Washington, D.C. and told Eisenhower, look, you have my blessing to call him, to release him, get rid of him. And Eisenhower stuck with him and said, no, we're going to have him on for a second term. And every other member of the Republican Party said, you got to drop Benson, he's too cantankerous, he's too volatile, he's toxic. And even the church president said, bring him home. And the reason why I said bring him home is because McKay thought that Benson was damaging the church with all the bad publicity.
So, this is about sort of his stance on welfare practice. A lot of conservatives who are skeptical of or opposed to welfare will assert that people who need stuff can get things from their family and from their church, and that's something I think that the church would be provided. It does really well with formally with granaries, discretionary funds, and informally with, your friends will watch over your wife and kids for you while you're off in Europe. Did he have any interesting stances on church welfare practices, or was he mostly in line with his contemporaries on that?
You talking about church welfare or government welfare?
Church welfare practices, yeah.
Yeah, so the church welfare system comes of age during the New Deal, right? Too many Utahns were, not just Utahns, but Latter-day Saints in general, were getting these government programs, like most Americans. So the church saw this as a problem. You're getting something for free, you're not working for it. And so this is the genesis of the church welfare system. And Ezra Taft Benson, the church had adopted his views on welfare. If you look at the handbook for welfare, from the 1950s all the way up until the 1980s. It's almost word for word some of the things that Benson said in sermons. It changed in 1990 when he's the church president. And I'm convinced that he did not know this was going on. I'm sure it was that old sinister, crafty Gordon Hinckley. But anyway, President Hinckley, his counselor, was a very able administrator, oversaw a change to the LDS Church Handbook in 1990 where it said that government welfare is permissible. There's no way that Ezra Taft Benson would have gone for that. But that's the first time where the church starts to back away from Benson's views on welfare. And of course, there was another clause in it that said, you can't be dependent upon the government. But it was just saying that you have our blessing as a church, that if you need that government assistance in addition to church assistance, it's okay.
Could you confirm, so I talked with Glenn Kimber, Cleon Skousen's son, who had said that during Benson's presidency, that Cleon and Kimber, they would go in for weekly meetings with the first presidency, sometimes weekly, sometimes bi-monthly, to be able to debrief the first presidency on the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations and everything going on internationally. Can you confirm if they were getting weekly briefings from Cleon during that time as the presidency?
This is whose presidency?
During Benson's presidency.
I find it awfully hard to believe. Yeah, I'll tell you why I find it hard to believe. It's because the first presidency did not, Gordon Hinckley and Tom Monson were in lockstep about the need to modernize the church. And they didn't like that sort of element, the right-wing element. And let me tell you two quick stories about this. That Ezra Taft Benson wanted to call Reed Benson, his son, into the Quorum of the 12, the first opening they had. And no, didn't happen. The other person they wanted to call in was another member of the Birch Society, a guy named H. Verlin Anderson. And Verlin Anderson taught accounting at BYU for a number of years, huge Bircher. And when Gordon Hinckley, this is in my book, so I'm going to tell you something that's not, be careful what I say sometimes. But when Verlin Anderson was called in as a general authority, he was expecting that he would be called into the 12. And instead, Gordon Hinckley said, congratulations, we're calling you to the second quorum of the 70, you'll be out in 3 years, goodbye. Didn't want him. And Gordon Hinckley called Desert Book and said, if anybody asks for Verlin Anderson's books, these are all these conspiratorial Getty and Rama books, remove them, tell them they're out of stock. And so Verlin Anderson got the lowest call you could get at the time, the second quorum for 3 years. And 3 years later, President Hinckley, who was still the first counselor, gave him his exit interview and said the same rules apply. You were not talking about Yad robbers or secret combinations. So I can't confirm what you just said, but it would strike me as really, really odd knowing what I know about President Hinckley. Also, too, one of the people that we would least think that would be maybe apolitical or would push back is Lloyd Packer. There was a general authority named Malcolm Jepson who was called to the Second Corps of 70 in 1989. And 2 weeks before he was called, Lloyd Packer was driving around Salt Lake. He knew Malcolm Jepson. They both grew up in Brigham City together. Malcolm Jepson was also the physician to Ezra and Flora Benson. And so, tight connection there. Well, anyway, Elder Packer was driving around Salt Lake, and he stopped in at Jepson's clinic where he was busy with a patient, and he interrupted the patient. He said, "Malcolm, I want to speak to you." And all he said to Malcolm was, "The Spirit told me, as I was driving around today, to tell you to not join the John Birch Society. You'll know soon. You'll know why soon enough." And 2 weeks later, he got his call. And I have Malcolm Jepson's diaries, and he's pretty clear on this. If I would have joined the John Birch Society, it would have been a disqualifying factor. The church is trying to get away from all of this stuff. Yeah?
You mentioned that it's this common perception that when Benson became church president that he softened. And you said that, it should be footnoted, that he was more constrained, perhaps, by his associates. But there's sort of two elements to that. One is maybe administratively what he could do or do with the church or church organization in promoting his agenda. But there's also his sermonizing. And you've shared some stories of maybe on the church administration side, maybe people have worked against some of his nominations for the 12 or other things. But what about for the sermonizing? Did you get, because it does seem that in his sermons he did not address as many of these political issues after he became president. Do you have any thoughts about that? Or it could be my perception is wrong. Certainly he's known for, right, his two big things, the Book of Mormon and pride.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So here's what I didn't tell you. We went through it pretty quick in the interest of time. But the 14 fundamentals talk that I showed up there, I said the liberals are complaining about it. Spencer Kimball was so angry with this talk that he called in Elder Benson and he made him apologize to the 12 apostles. And President Kimball didn't think it was sufficiently contrite, so he had him come back for a second apology to all the general authorities the following week. And that was the last time, as I write in this book, that's the last time that he spoke really in earnest publicly about politics or something controversial. Now, I went through his presidency very carefully. I looked through published sermons in General Conference. I looked through things he had written. I looked through even talks that he had given at state conferences that weren't published. And I can only count a handful of times, just in some offhand way, where he talks about be aware of growing federal agencies. He mentioned secret combinations a handful of times, but never a sermon devoted to it. It was just sort of offhand. Because I think it's to President Benson's credit, he was reading the tea leaves that he just couldn't do this anymore. And so what he does is, he recognized it was controversial as a church president. But what he does is, here's the dirty secret. He relies on surrogates like Berlin Anderson. When he called Berlin Anderson into the Second Quorum of the 70, he told Berlin Anderson, your job is to finish that book on the Book of Mormon we've been talking about. And that book on the Book of Mormon was all about conspiracy. And so when they recognized what Berlin Anderson was doing, Gordon Hinckley said, we need to read this. We, meaning apostles. So they had Hinckley named 3 apostles to read the book. You're not going to publish this. And so he couldn't publish it, even though the church president wanted him to publish it when he was a general authority. President Hinckley wouldn't allow it. And so the book was published in 1995, 3 years after Berlin Anderson left the court. And he died in 92. So he was emeritus and he died just shortly thereafter. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And President Hinckley, let me show you one last thing about President Hinckley. In 1998, he speaks to the NAACP. First time a church president speaks to this black civil rights group. Once again, he's doing damage control. He's trying to modernize the church. You cannot grow the church, especially in predominantly black countries or black cities or black neighborhoods, if you've got a church leader who argues that the NAACP and Dr. King are all a bunch of commies. So Hinckley is very, very perceptive about image. And I would also argue Russell Nelson is too. Yeah?
So I've been sitting here thinking about President Monson's, what I consider to be kind of the amazing behind-the-scenes process that led to the Berlin Temple before the Iron Curtain ever came down. And so here we have one of the brethren marshaling the powers that be in order to have a temple in a communist-controlled country. Am I correct about
You are
that?
correct.
What I don't know is, where in the sequence of all of these events, do you happen to know, where in this whole landscape did that happen? Was it after President Benson was dead? Or was that also brewing during the same time that they were trying to manage him? I don't know my history well enough to know the time frame, but I have thought about how it wasn't just the black issue where damage could be done when then President Monson's were, I don't know when that started or how that happened, but I considered it to be a major political sort of miracle that the church was able to build a temple in a communist country before the wall ever came down. And so I just wondered if you could situate that in relationship to all this other stuff going on.
Yeah, there's two things. There are two little interesting oddities going on here with President Benson's presidency. One would be that there is a temple behind the Iron Curtain, and Junior Apostle Russell Nelson's the one that helps to spearhead that. He's given that assignment, and he's written about that publicly. And the second one that's...
So it wasn't President Monson then, I had that wrong.
No, Monson plays a part too.
Oh, I see.
Monson and Nelson both spearhead this. Yeah. Monson had been in Eastern Europe for a long time, even prior to this. But Russell Nelson in particular, I know, was over there and did work on the temple.
I see.
And the other one is that, of course, the church's first black general authority is called under Benson's watch. And one of the questions I wish I knew the answer to is, did President Benson call Elder Martinez, or was it Gordon Hinckley? I'm going to go with Gordon Hinckley. And also, did President Benson, was it his doing that there was a temple behind the Iron Curtain, or was it Gordon Hinckley? I think the second option is more likely to be Benson, because he had been behind the Iron Curtain himself, and he always talked about these folks need the gospel, they need churches and temples. So it wouldn't surprise me if he led that charge. But it would really surprise me if Ezra Taft Benson supported Helvecchio Martinez called to the general authority ranks. I can't imagine that would happen.
So it was happening under President Benson's watch, so to speak, which leads to one more question, if you don't mind, which is, how would you describe, overall, how would you describe the way that the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency really work when it comes to, I don't know, when it just comes to the operations of the church?
Like a big dysfunctional family. I'm not trying to be funny, but it's true.
Yeah.
Having read dozens and dozens of their letters and diaries and private papers and quorum minutes and all of this stuff, I think that's a great way, I think, to understand how the 12 works. Because you have some folks in the 12 who like each other and some who don't. But at the end of the day, they're still family and they defend and protect their own. And so I don't think it's any secret that Boyd Packer and Dieter Uchtdorf did not like each other. And there wasn't a secret either when just before President Packer died in 2015, it showed, I saw a picture in the church news, I think, of Dieter Uchtdorf pushing his wheelchair. You can imagine in my mind's eye, hey Uchtdorf, we need a photo op, things aren't going well. Get over there and push that wheelchair. I'm being crass. But that's how these things sometimes work. And they, let me tell you one quick story. I was talking to someone recently who told me that that when one of the apostles was called into the 12, the counsel that President Packer gave this apostle was, don't go out with another apostle, you and your wife. Don't do it. We don't want factions. And I asked the person who told me this, the brother of the apostle. I said, what did your brother do? Ignore the counsel. He goes out with whoever he wants to. So they're very sensitive to how they get along and the consensus they try to build to produce church doctrine.
And how it looks, and, yeah.
Yeah, let me say one thing about Revelation of the church. Revelation is so, they're the sudden strokes of influence or ideas in my mind. That's all how the church defines Revelation. That's all true. But Revelation, from an institutional standpoint, is really the leaders sitting around the table here, and they debate and they hash things out. And then they vote, and then they pray, and that's what becomes a revelation. It's not that grandiose. And in some cases, if somebody gets outvoted, they'll abstain from voting because the revelations state that there has to be a consensus. I'll let you decide if that's a true consensus, right? But they just won't vote. But they do try to reach a consensus. And oftentimes, that's why the church, why new doctrines or policies take so darn long, is because they can't reach a consensus, because they have such strong views.
You know, just on that front, and I apologize, if somebody else needs to ask a question, I shouldn't dominate here. I don't want to dominate if somebody else has a question. But I am just as a comment and to get your perceptions on this. From an outsider's perspective, when I read President Kimball's, that chapter in his book that Ed Kimball wrote about how the priesthood revelation, which is, in my opinion, the only real revelation we've had in my lifetime. To me, the rest of it is policy, but that's a different debate. He seemed to go around to each one separately, almost like kind of a divide and conquer, and get everybody on board individually before they ever got together. And to me, that became the genius that the Lord prompted him to do in order to get this herd of elephants herded together on that score. Do you have any other sort of insights about that particular process that he used?
Oh, do I?
And
I just finished a 500-page book on this topic.
say that again?
I just finished a massive book on this very topic.
Okay.
Let me give you the Reader's Digest version because we're running out of time.
Okay.
President Kimball wants to lift the priesthood ban the minute he becomes the church president. But he has holdups in the quorum.
Right.
He has hardliners in the quorum, and as you said so well, that he has to go around and meet with them individually and collectively. There are 3 people he can't win over. 2 people are not there at the time of the revelation. This is, Ed Kimball writes about this. Delbert Stapley is
In the hospital.
in a hospital. He'll die 2 months later in August. Mark Peterson is in South America on a church assignment. There was no coincidence whatsoever that he was not in Salt Lake when they had that revelation. And the 3rd person is our guy tonight, Elder Benson. So Elder Benson wants to table discussion about praying about lifting the ban on June 2nd, 1978. He wants to table it, and President Kimball said, nope, we're going to do it today. They've been trying to do it the previous months, but he didn't have the buy-in from the quorum. And so one of his finest hours as church president is, just as you said, is trying to get them to realize that you can't expand the church. Now think about, some of you guys are old enough in this room, every member a missionary, lengthen your stride. How can you bring the church and globalize the gospel if you can't get into Black Africa? And Spencer Kimball knows more than anybody else this dreadful ban has to go if the church is going to flourish. And one of his best moments, I think, and I admire him so much on this, is that of all people, if I were to ask you which is the person that gave him the biggest holdup, you might say Bruce McConkie, and we'd all be wrong. Bruce McConkie is the one that he does this strategically. He's the biggest doctrinal expert in the church, and he tells Bruce, we've got a problem. We've got this temple in Brazil. What do you think we should do? Like, President Kimball knows what needs to be done, but he wants Elder Kimball or Elder McConkie to come to the conclusion himself that we have to lift the ban in order to go into Brazil. And one last thing about that is, folks, listen, the church had followed the one drop rule. Anybody who has a particle of African blood in them is considered cursed. How do you tell? You don't. They have been baptizing and conferring priesthood ordination on Black people for decades, and they know this is going on. Because you can't, there's no such thing as these racially pure bloodlines, right? So anyway, that's President Kimball in a nutshell, is that he's able to get Elder McConkie, who in turn helps to get the other members of the 12 to come on board. But they can't do it with Stapley, Peterson, and then Benson, to his credit, though, does come around. But it wasn't easy.
Now let's do one more.
Perfect. Who haven't we heard from tonight? This lady?
Yeah.
about your third point on this slide, specifically Brian David Mitchell and Julie Rowe?
Yeah, so Brian David Mitchell is, when President Benson is the president in 1994, he christens himself Emmanuel,
Right.
and he argues that there's going to be that Emmanuel's going to come, and he is quoting Ezra Taft Benson, some of his sermons on the Book of Mormon, and how he reads Isaiah, the Isaiah portions of the Book of Mormon. That's that connection. And then, I'm sure, Ezra Taft Benson is sick and failing health at this point. And guys like this guy would make Ezra Taft Benson just squeamish as all get out, right? The other person you mentioned is this woman here. And Julie Rowe has a near-death experience in 2003. She claims to see visions, and in her visions, she essentially articulates all of these John Birch Society themes. On her webpage, she puts John Birch up, Ezra Taft Benson up, and the whole genesis of her, what she's about, her identity, if you will, is the end times, that when Jesus comes again. And one of the sermons that she put to highlight her views on the end times was a sermon that Ezra Taft Benson gave in 1981 when he was the president of the Quorum of the 12. So she's co-opted a lot of these Benson/Birch Society themes and worked them into her book. And that becomes the basis of some of her visions. And if some of you don't know, she was told to stop. They were using her books in seminaries and institutes, and they cut that out pretty quick. And her bishop told her to stop, as I understand it, talking about these things, and she didn't, and she was excommunicated.
The reason I ask is, since I study fundamentalist Mormonism, I see, obviously, Brian David Mitchell being more on the fundamentalist side.
Yeah.
In certain groups, use some of their documents or transcriptions of talks from the Council of Friends. You have mention of Ezra Taft Benson, but like on a personal level, they're not citing him from the pulpit. There's a level of familiarity in some of these documents, and so I just wondered how some of these more contemporary people fall into that, and if there's some connection to this, to the Council of Friends back in the 50s and 60s.
Well, Matt and I were talking about this tonight, in fact, about we could draw a Venn diagram, and a lot of these ideas go back to Benson. And some of these folks, they do quote Benson directly, like the Bundys, for example, and Glenn Beck. They are unabashed in their love for Benson. Others are more subtle, like Julie Rowe, David Brian Mitchell. But they're definitely talking about him, they're saying his name, and they're certainly utilizing his ideas in their own, to advance their own agendas. There's a lot to this story about Mormon extremism. We've got the nuts in Idaho on trial now, the Daybell, that story, Jeff.
Yeah.
That's another whole part of this, right? I'm certain if Ezra Taft Benson were alive today, he'd be squeamish about all of this stuff. But it really is, the foundation has been sown over the last 60 years.
Okay. Good. Well, we thank you all for coming. Matt can stay around for a little bit. I know because I'm his ride. And so if you'd like to chat with him for a few minutes, he is here. But yeah, we are grateful we were able to do this. Hopefully we can again soon. So thank you, Matt.